Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Diane Grohl. I'm the Assistant Scientific Director for CIMVHR, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you to the veteran session for today's forum presentation. We have 8 fascinating talks today covering a variety of issues affecting veterans, so I hope that you will find this session extremely interesting. All the talks have been pre-recorded, so we can't stop them, but we do have time for questions afterwards. We have the speakers who put together the talks coming and joining us for the question period. So if you have anything you want to say or want to ask a question during the talks, please put it in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be able to ask the speakers once they're done their talks. There are 2 breaks during this session. One will be at 11:20 and one will be at 12:25, approximately, depending on how we're doing. They're each 5 minutes long, so feel free during that time to run and grab a drink, go to the bathroom, whatever you would like to do. There's a few housekeeping notes I have. If you're having issues with your stream quality, please click on the click here to switch to the alternate stream button below the video player, which will take you to your alternate stream. And if you're having any other technical issues, click the help or aider button at the top of the menu of, at the top menu of the page. You can then send in a help request to the technical team and they'll respond and they'll be able to help you. So just without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Natalie Mota. She is our first speaker today, and she will be speaking on the prevalence and correlates of military sexual trauma in the 2018 Canadian Armed Forces members and veterans' mental health. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to be talking about the results of a study titled The Prevalence and Correlates of Military Sexual Trauma in Service Members and Veterans. And these are results from the 2018 Canadian Armed Forces Members and Veterans Mental Health Follow-Up Survey, which I will be referring to as the CIMVHR because it's quite the mouthful. I'd like to acknowledge the other co-authors on the study. And I received research support from the CIMVHR and from the Deer Lodge Center Foundation Research Award. And the CIMVHR has received financial support from CIMVHR, the Canadian Armed Forces, True Patriot Love, Veterans Affairs Canada, and CIMVHR in the form of research grants. And this program also received in-kind support from Statistics Canada in the form of data collection. And I have not received payment or funding from any organization whose products are being discussed in this program. The funders did not have any role in the conceptualization or interpretation of the data. And at the end of this presentation, I hope that attendees will be able to identify the prevalence and correlates of military sexual trauma in a large contemporary sample of Canadian Armed Forces members and veterans. So we know that military sexual trauma, or MST, is a persistent problem that continues to be problematic and that has been associated with a range of negative health outcomes, including increased likelihood of a number of mental disorders, physical health conditions, and the development of chronic pain. And in a recent meta-analysis of 69 studies that were mostly conducted in US military samples, the lifetime prevalence of MST was found to be 38.4% in females and 3.9% in males, when the definition of MST included both sexual harassment and assault. There is a lot less data in Canadian Armed Forces, but in a 2013 nationally representative cross-sectional sample of CAF regular force members, the lifetime prevalence of MST was found to be 15.5% for females and just under 1% for males. And this is when the definition included unwanted sexual touching and sexual assault. And although the authors were unable to examine correlates associated with MST in males because of the low sample size, among females, correlates included being single, being in a higher rank, which we interpreted as possibly having more years in the service and therefore a larger period of time in which MST could occur. And a higher number of non-sexual traumatic events, so a higher trauma load in general. But when we look at the literature related to MST as a whole, there are a number of key limitations in the research. The first is that most studies have been conducted in US military samples. And because of certain cell sizes having small numbers, most studies have been unable to examine sex-specific correlates of MST, which could identify potentially unique subgroups among males and females separately for further prevention and intervention initiatives. Further, to date, we know of no other study that has examined the prevalence of MST among CAF veterans. And in general, updated studies of MST prevalence and correlates are needed in light of recent initiatives both within the CAF and larger socio-political movements like the Me Too initiative, which may impact comfort with disclosure of MST experiences. And so our current study aims were to use the 2018 CAVMS data to examine, number one, the prevalence of MST among males and females separately, and then number two, the demographic and military correlates of MST relative to non-military sexual trauma and no sexual trauma. So the CAVMS sample consisted of 2,941 participants, with the breakdown being 34.5% of those participants who were still currently serving in the regular force and 65.5% who were now veterans. And this is a 2018 follow-up sample from the 2002 Canadian Community Health Survey on Mental Health and Wellbeing Canadian Forces Supplement, which had been a nationally representative survey of regular force participants conducted in 2002. So in this 2018 sample, we had a response rate of 68% of the regular force participants who participated in the 2002 survey, with an age range beginning at 33 and older, because the initial age range in 2002 was ages 17 and higher. MST in this sample was assessed with two items. The first, identifying sexual assault with the item, we define sexual assault as anyone forcing you or attempting to force you into any unwanted sexual activity by threatening you, holding you down, or hurting you in some way. Has this ever happened to you? And the second question, assessing unwanted sexual touching with has anyone ever touched you against your will in any sexual way? And by this, I mean unwanted touching or grabbing to kissing or fondling. Individuals who endorsed either one of these items were asked an additional 3 items about whether any one of these events had taken place while deployed as part of a CAF operation, whether any of these events had occurred in a CAF workplace, and whether the perpetrator of MST had been a member of the CAF or a civilian employee of the DND. And individuals endorsing any one of those items were placed into our group of MST reporting. Individuals who endorsed either one of these sexual trauma items but not any of the military-related types or contexts were placed in a non-military sexual trauma group, and then all other individuals were in a no sexual trauma group. We used cross-tabulations to calculate the prevalence of MST and the context in which it had occurred in both male and female members and veterans. And we examined associations between different demographic variables and this three-level sexual trauma variable. We applied sampling weights to all inferential analyses to ensure that our sample was representative of the original 2002 cohort. And bootstrapping was used as a standard error estimation technique to account for the complex survey sampling design. So first I'll present the overall prevalence of MST. Among females, 44.6% of participants reported a lifetime prevalence of MST, the breakdown being 48.3% in active duty members and 42.6% in veterans. And there was no statistically significant difference between the prevalence of active duty service members and veterans. Among males, the total prevalence of MST was 4.8%, with a prevalence estimate of 5.7% among active duty participants and 4.3% among veterans. And again, no differences between active duty members and veterans. Here you see the percentages and 95% confidence intervals of the different contexts and types of military sexual trauma. So those three questions that were asked in sexual assault individually, in unwanted sexual touching, and then in any military sexual trauma variable. And they are broken down by the total sample. So this is the subsample of individuals who endorsed MST, and then in males and females separately. So looking at that third category, any military sexual trauma, we see that 41.2% of individuals endorsing MST reported that at least one of those events had occurred while deployed on a CAF operation. 66% of individuals reporting MST indicated that MST had occurred in the CAF workplace other than the deployment. And 85.6% of individuals endorsing MST indicated that at least one of their reported MST events had been committed by a CAF member or a civilian DND employee. On this slide, we present stratified by females and males, the demographic and military correlates of MST. So in females, being in that younger age group, which was this 33 to 49-year-old age group in this sample, relative to the oldest age group, which was individuals 60 plus, we found that younger age group was more likely to report sexual trauma. So both non-military and military sexual trauma relative to no sexual trauma. And we present here relative risk ratios to show the size of that effect. We also found that a greater number of non-sexual traumas was associated with both non-military and military sexual trauma, and that being in the lower income bracket relative to earning $50,000 or higher was also associated with both non-military and military sexual trauma, while lifetime deployment in females was associated with MST only. In males, we see some of the similar trends with, again, that younger age group relative to the oldest age group being more likely to report both types of sexual trauma, so both MST and non-MST, and a higher number of non-sexual traumatic events also associated with both types of sexual trauma. So to summarize some of the take-home points and important conclusions, this study found that the prevalence of lifetime MST was 44.6% in females and 4.8% in males, with an overall prevalence estimate of 9.6%. And so this breaks down into finding that females were approximately 9 times more likely to experience MST than males. and we found comparable prevalence estimates between currently serving members and veterans. Among individuals who endorsed MST, we found that 96.7% of females and 71.5% of males reported that at least one assault had been perpetrated by a CAF member or a DND employee. And among both males and females, we found that the youngest age bracket and a higher number of non-sexual traumas was associated with MST, whereas lower income category and a history of deployment was associated with MST in females only. So taken together, this study found a high prevalence of lifetime MST in this sample, which really highlights the need for ongoing systemic efforts to prevent MST within the CAF. So for example, there have been some recommendations to prevent MST that have been made by the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. And other researchers have also pointed to additional military leadership training in recognizing MST as having potential implications for mitigating the risk of sexual violence. There's also been some literature suggesting that other efforts need to be focused on reducing stigma associated with disclosure, and that one possible way in which to facilitate this would be universal MST screening of members. And of course, both in currently serving members and within veterans, really helping to support survivors with access to resources, be it psychological interventions, disability benefits, and so forth for survivors of MST. There were a number of limitations of the data we examined. This is a 16-year follow-up of a nationally representative cross-sectional survey in 2002 of serving members. And so it would not be representative of the current composition of CAF service members and veterans. And while the survey assessed biological sex as a variable, it did not assess gender differences, and this is a very important area for future direction. And finally, MST was assessed with only 2 questions, and it was only assessed within a lifetime time frame. So it would be very useful to know kind of current estimates of MST, so for example, over the past 12 months, and potentially other types of MSTs to really understand and gain a comprehensive picture of the overall burden of MST within the CAF. Thank you so much. These are some selected references that I've referred to throughout this presentation, and I'll take any questions now.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question from the chat already. So what about the multiple iterations of the SSMCAF? So that's the Survey on Sexual Misconduct in the CAF.
Yes, absolutely. So that is other Canadian data that we have. To my knowledge, there have been kind of 2 iterations in 2016 and 2018, I believe. And to my knowledge, I believe kind of past year MST was reported among current CAF veterans at about kind of 4.4% in females and just over 1% in males. I think kind of what this study kind of adds above and beyond that is the ability to then compare those estimates with the sample of veterans in the CAVMs, as well as kind of look at that kind of a more comprehensive burden of lifetime MST. So another piece of the puzzle here.
Great. Great, thank you very much. I guess we have time for a few more questions. So why do the estimates of MST in the current study appear higher than those of some previous studies?
Yeah, so it's important to note that these findings are preliminary and are still undergoing peer review. But there are a number of reasons why our team hypothesized that they might be different. The first is that this is an older cohort overall of CAF members and veterans. So as I mentioned, it is a representative cohort of participants who participated in the 2002 study. So with ages beginning at 33 and higher, that might have something to do with it. And again, I mentioned kind of socio-political movements like Me Too that may have increased kind of comfort with disclosure. And of course, it is possible that that this is a cohort who kind of suffered more greatly with experiences of MST, perhaps due also to kind of being before a lot of the CAF initiatives to kind of mitigate the risk of MST occurring.
Great. I'll ask one last question then, and we'll move on. Did your study see more than one sexual assault in some individuals?
Oh yes, yeah. So the items were at least one.
Okay.
I don't know that we have number of sexual assaults recorded in the data. So to my knowledge, we're unable to examine kind of one versus multiple. But yes, the experience is referred to kind of at least one incident.
Great. Okay, so thank you very, very much, Dr. Mota. I'm going to now introduce Dr. Lia Bao. She is the next presenter, and she's going to give us a presentation on the barriers and facilitators of coping following military sexual assault, a narrative inquiry with female veterans. Over to you, Dr. Bao.
All right, so today I'm presenting on the barriers and facilitators of coping following military sexual trauma, a narrative inquiry with women veterans. So my name is Lia Bao. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of British Columbia. The research supervisor for this project is Dr. Marla Buchanan. And I'll get into more of the relationships with commercial interests on the next slide. So disclosure of commercial support. This research has received financial support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in the form of a doctoral fellowship, as well as the Killam Laureate in the form of a Killam Doctoral Scholarship. And the study has received in-kind support with participant recruitment from the Military Sexual Trauma Service Provider, It's Just 700, and the Veterans Transition Network. And potential for conflict of interest. So I worked as a research assistant for the Veterans Transition Network for 4 years before beginning the current research study. And so to mitigate that potential bias, my research position with the Veterans Transition Network ended a year before beginning this research study. And so there isn't an overlap between the research projects, and the Veterans Transition Network's involvement in the study was just in recruitment materials, so sending those to their members and inviting potential participants to reach out directly to myself if they were interested in joining the study. So the learning objectives for this presentation, my hope is that you'll gain an understanding of the barriers and facilitators of coping that women veterans encounter after experiencing sexual assault while serving in the Canadian military. Beginning with the research problem. So while coping with post-traumatic stress has been studied within the context of war-related traumatic events, the research on coping after military sexual trauma is quite limited, especially in Canadian literature, despite the prevalence among women veterans. So women service members are more likely to experience military sexual trauma than symptoms of traumatic stress from war. And the military has failed to address the harassment and sexual assault that women veterans experience during service. And so we've seen this in violence and sexual assault against women that's often explained away or tolerated, and in the minimal consequences for perpetrators. So the research purpose is to examine the barriers and facilitators of coping among women veterans who identify as survivors of military sexual trauma. So narrative inquiry is the overarching method that I've been using. And so narrative inquiry is the study of lived experiences through the interpretation of stories. And specifically, Buchanan-Arvey's collaborative narrative method was used. And so here are the steps of the research study. Began with recruitment and screening, and then in-depth interviews conducted with each participant. Preliminary themes were extracted from the transcripts regarding barriers and facilitators of coping that I'm presenting on now. And then narrative text collaboratively written between the participant and myself, researcher, for each individual story. And then finally, Braun and Clark's across narrative method to identify the main themes across the narrative accounts. So this is a summary slide of the barriers and facilitators of coping that have been identified in the interim analysis. I'll move into sharing examples of each of these, drawing on quotes from the interview transcripts in the following slides. And so the salient barriers that were apparent across participants' experiences include shame and blaming themselves, fearing the consequences of speaking out, and the lack of accountability and consequences for perpetrators. In contrast, the facilitators that were salient across participants' experiences include safe contexts where survivors are heard and believed, social support from military members / veterans, and social support from other survivors, and then finally mental health support for symptoms of PTSD. So here's a quote from Amara regarding shame as a barrier to coping. After the sexual assault, I was just so embarrassed and scared that I never told anybody, so reporting was just not even an option. It was like shame, like it was sort of my fault. I can look back and see it was awful that I was able to normalize it, the culture. I was so entrenched in it that I didn't even know it was wrong. Fearing the consequences of speaking out. So Sarah says, you can't report it, just suck it up, buttercup type of thing, told to keep your mouth shut, worried about the repercussions of being blackballed and possibly losing out on promotions or desirable postings or things like that. Lack of knowledge too as a barrier, because I didn't know that it shouldn't be like this. And I didn't want to be ostracized if I did tell someone. And then the third barrier to coping that came up across participant narratives is the lack of accountability and consequences. So Aileen says, they had no harassment policies, no people that you go to in the 70s. It really wasn't until 85 that harassment programs started, or any way that you could report. And I mean, the system is so wrong because any complaints that come on his, so she was speaking about the warrant officer's desk, he can do whatever he likes. Can look at it and say, oh, she's not telling the truth. You know, it's a problem. How are women believed, right? Especially when that goes up the ranks and it's still their word that matters, especially when it's MPs, so military police. So really not having the support in a system. And then Hannah adds to that saying, there's no consequences for him. You were left feeling some of the responsibility. No reporting, no 1-800 number that I was aware of that you could have called and got counsel or anything. I'm thinking that would have been something that would have helped you, like having an easy number to access. Moving into the facilitators of coping that were salient for participants. Safe contexts where survivors are heard and believed. So Anne says, I find when I'm talking about it, every now and then afterwards, I talk to someone who understands what I've gone through and makes me feel like, well, no, you're not at fault. It wasn't you. Don't blame yourself. You weren't in control at the time. There was somebody else in control. And social support came up as a significant facilitator, and this is in line with other existing research on coping after trauma. So the veterans shared that social support from military members and veterans, as well as other military sexual trauma survivors in the Canadian Armed Forces, supported them. And so Macy says, Bob has been the turning point, actually, that's got me on a better path. He came along when I got myself settled, and I was at the point where I knew that I was going to be good in the end, just working on building myself up. He's a veteran too, and he also has mental health issues. And he came along and he was recognizing all these things in me. And he just helped me to realize that it's a mental health issue because something happened, and I shouldn't be putting myself down all the time because of that. He also lifts me up. He is probably the first man in many, 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 many years, I can say, has said something nice about me and does it all the time. He lifts me up, just like the counselor does. And yeah, he's recognizing that what happened in the military is wrong. And then Megan reported on just the social support that she received from another military sexual trauma survivor. She says, "She's just one of the people in the world that I trust the most. It's only recently, within the last month, that she started to share some of her military sexual trauma experience with me. This layer of sexual trauma going on at the same time. So we talk a lot about that." And finally, mental health support was another common facilitator of coping across the participant transcripts. So Macy says, "I see my counselor. She helps remind me how far I've come and the progress I've made and how I'm helping and doing good things. So I guess that's my coping mechanism right now, just reminding myself that I am a good person, I do have good things going on right now, and that I do have purpose in life." And finally, onto recommendations. So all participants talked about military culture and how normalized sexual harassment is in the military. This fits with Lombard and McMillan's research findings that there are higher rates of violence against women in cultures and contexts where women are viewed as more unequal compared to men, and points to the importance of systemic change in the military. And so I've also shared 3 specific avenues to address culture change in the military. So namely proactive education regarding gender-based violence and sexual harassment, and a commitment from all service members to take action and challenge these previously normalized behaviors. Secondly, accountability and consequences for perpetrators of sexual harassment with a no tolerance policy. And finally, accessible and comprehensive support both within the military and outside the military for service members and veterans who have experienced military sexual trauma. And I just want to end with a quote from Emma, who shared her recommendations. And she says, "Need a safe place for people to be able to go outside of the military with no repercussions, but actual advocates, a real heart. We will help." Yeah, something like that needs to be set up, absolutely. An actual lifeline. Maybe this should be called Lifeline. Thank you. Comments and questions are welcome.
Great, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk, Lia. We've got a few questions. I'll go with the first one. So what have you been most surprised by as you facilitated these interviews with the women veterans?
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully you can hear me okay here. Yeah, I think one of the things that surprised me most was their ability to hold on to their sense of humanity. So after experiencing such horrendous and really dehumanizing acts and betrayal of trust, like many of these women, they came to the study and were like, "I don't even want the honorarium. I just want there to be a difference for other veterans, so that this is not continually taking place." And so I think that is something, yeah, that probably surprised me most. And then I think also just the paradox, I suppose, of on the one hand, they would they talked about military culture and were so frustrated with and have been so wounded, right, by military sexual trauma and gender-based violence that are so normalized in this culture. And at the same time, they also talked about it as being like a family. And so there's, I think I was just surprised, by the paradox that they held between recognizing how painful their experience was, and then also just what they appreciated about the military at the same time. So yeah.
Great. Could you speak more to specific inclusion criteria for the participants in the study?
Absolutely, yes. And so I did a screening with them just to understand a bit about their history. I define military sexual trauma really broadly, and so from unwanted touching to sexual assault like rape, and all participants spoke about how they had not just experienced all of them had experienced a significant sexual assault, and so that was part of the screening. Also, just checked in with them about resources that they currently have, just making sure that they were in a space where it was appropriate for them, just wanting to protect and ensure that their mental health is being cared for. I'm trying to think about what other things. I'm sure I asked more things. I asked a little bit about their background, a little bit about why they were interested in the military. So trying to just from this narrative perspective, just really trying to understand their story.
Thank you. So after your research, was this acknowledged by CAF, and did this identify additional funding for mental health supports for members across Canada?
Not that I'm aware of. This study was definitely separate from CAF, so not associated with it, and so I'm actually not super familiar just with what CAF has been offering them. I did also want to note that I didn't in my presentation, but all of the names, and I'm sure that you probably all know this already, but they're de-identified, and so I used pseudonyms for all of the participants. Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much. No, it's an absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you. We're now going to go for a break. We're going to have a break until 11:25 when we come back. So everybody can go and enjoy yourselves, and we'll see you back at 11:25. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good time, a good break. I'm now going to introduce Mary Keeling. Dr. Mary Keeling is going to be talking about understanding the psychological well-being and support needs of military personnel and veterans affected by appearance-altering conflict wounds. Mary, take it away.
Hello, I'm Dr. Mary Keeling, and I am presenting today on our 3-year project that we've just completed, understanding the psychosocial well-being and support needs of military personnel and veterans affected by appearance-altering conflict wounds. And I'm presenting on behalf of our team at the Centre for Appearance Research at the University of the West of England, Bristol. So just to say that we don't have any conflicts of interest, no commercial interest. The research was funded by the Scar-Free Foundation, which is a charity organisation, so no commercial interests and no potential biases to declare. The learning objectives from today is at the end of this presentation, participants will have learned about appearance-related psychological adjustment following appearance-altering injuries such as scars and limb loss that may have been sustained during operational deployments or training, and that you'd have understood about evidence-based approaches to appearance-related support for military personnel and veterans who may have experienced appearance-related challenges or distress following physical injuries. So the background to this project is that there are a moderate but significant number of military personnel who sustained injuries that have resulted in a change to their appearance, such as limb loss or scarring. When we look at research with civilian populations, there's evidence to indicate that sustaining appearance-altering injuries can affect psychosocial well-being. So there's a psychosocial impact of burns and limb loss and other disfiguring injuries that can be both extensive and enduring. Research, however, has shown that adjustment to appearance-altering injuries is influenced by psychosocial factors and processes. In addition to an impact on individuals, it can then also be an impact on family members, and this can be quite significant. Within the civilian population, there's evidence to show that cognitive behavioural-based interventions can help support people adjust to appearance-altering injuries. However, when we look at the military population, there's little known about the psychosocial well-being of military personnel and veterans who sustained conflict-related appearance-altering injuries, and we cannot assume that what we know about civilians will be transferable to the military population. So our 3-year project aimed to understand the needs and support provision for military personnel and veterans who have sustained appearance-altering injuries, to understand how their experiences are similar or may be different to civilian groups with appearance-altering injuries, and therefore understand the appropriateness of existing civilian support interventions to be used to support military populations with appearance-altering injuries. And so using that information, we would then decide whether we need to develop new interventions to support military populations with appearance-altering injuries, or whether we could adapt existing interventions developed for civilians. We would then, having even adapted or developed those interventions, assess the feasibility and acceptability of those with military populations. So to achieve those objectives over the last 3 years, we have conducted 4 studies, starting with the gap analysis, followed by some qualitative studies, a quantitative survey study, and then intervention development, and now in the final stages looking at grant applications. I'm not going to go into too much detail because with the time we have a lot to cover. But I'll tell you a little bit more now about the first study, which was the gap analysis. So this included stakeholder engagement. So we engaged with several key support organisations within the UK to understand whether anybody was currently providing any support specifically to meet the needs of people who have had appearance-altering injuries. And we found out that there is currently no specific appearance-related support within the UK. We conducted a literature review to see what was existing within the literature of evidence about the experiences of military populations who have sustained appearance-altering injuries. We initially came back with 428 articles. However, once we'd gone through eligibility screening, we only identified 4 currently published papers that have specifically looked at the appearance and body image concerns of military populations who have sustained injuries that change their appearance. 3 of those being from the US and 1 from Turkey, with no research currently to date at that time having been conducted in the UK. Those 4 papers indicated that there is emerging evidence that within the military populations who have sustained appearance-altering injuries, that they do experience appearance-related distress, and that their adjustment to that appearance distress may be affected by military cultural nuances. We've published that paper in the Journal of Military Behavioural Health if you'd like to learn more about that review. But that review basically provided more evidence for the need of this project. There is no research to date, or there was no research to date in the UK that was looking to understand the impact of appearance-altering injuries on military populations. So we then started with 3 qualitative studies. The first was included interviews with military veterans and serving personnel who had sustained appearance-altering injuries during deployments or training for deployments. We also interviewed partners, in which only females came forward to take part, and we also included parents, of which only mothers came forward to take part. So we interviewed 23 veterans and serving personnel, 11 female partners, and 6 mothers. That was individual telephone interviews, and we used reflexive thematic analysis to analyse those transcripts. All of our participants were self-selecting, and we used a multi-pronged recruitment strategy, mostly by connecting with various support organisations and also using social media. I'm going to be quite broad in the main findings from these 3 qualitative studies, but overall the most common challenge that was reported was the experience of unwanted public attention. So when being out and about with friends and family in public, experiencing people staring and also asking questions. In addition to unwanted public attention, other challenges included psychological distress, such as low confidence and self-worth, difficulties with relationships, an impact on their children, and also a feeling of a loss of a previous military physique and the impact that had on body image and self-esteem. Military-specific protective factors were, however, identified. So many of those veterans that we spoke to, and also some of their family members, reported that they had actually expected that they might be injured, and that had helped them accept the situation and adjust quickly. Recovering in hospital environments, surrounded by other veterans who sustained similar injuries, also helped keep up morale and adjustment. And then experiencing a positive regard from the general public towards injured war veterans helped them feel that they weren't necessarily being judged too negatively, and instead were probably being judged positively for their contribution to their country. In addition to these protective factors, there was evidence for other various coping strategies. This included ways of rationalizing the stigma that they might have experienced. So having compassion that maybe people haven't seen people with limb loss and prosthetics before, and so maybe they're looking because they're curious rather than being judgmental. In addition, using sporting activities to aid recovery helped build confidence. Having an optimistic outlook was also helpful. Creating safe narratives so that when people did ask them questions, that they had a way of responding that helped them manage their anxiety was also reported by several of the veterans and family members. And also experiencing and normalizing and accepting that people are different. And staying connected was also important, such as social support. Most of the people that we spoke to said that they would have benefited from receiving appearance-specific support, but hadn't done so far. And in addition, that they may experience barriers. So many that we spoke to spoke about how they felt that they may be considered being vain for having concerns about their appearance, or that because their injury maybe wasn't as severe as other people's appearances, and this sort of perceived hierarchy of injuries, that they maybe not be considered worthy for support. So we used what we found from those qualitative studies to then design and conduct a survey study, with the main aim of this to understand the differences between veterans and civilians with appearance-altering injuries. So the key findings from this survey study, of which we managed to recruit 121 veterans with appearance-altering injuries and 197 civilians with comparable appearance-altering injuries, shows that many veterans and civilians experience negative feelings about their appearance. And they also experience social anxiety, and veterans seem to report higher social anxiety compared to the civilian group. Many reported a fear that they would be negatively evaluated based upon their appearance, and some disengaged from life activities because of how they feel about their appearance. And this life disengagement was also higher among veterans compared to civilians. Symptoms of depression and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder were also reported, and both of these were also at higher rates within the veteran group compared to the civilians. So this shows that there are several significant number of veterans who do experience appearance-related distress, and that this is, for some, at higher rates compared to civilians. We also looked at factors associated with these experiences. The key factor that came out as being associated with appearance distress was something called body image flexibility, which is similar to psychological flexibility. And that's the ability to live a value-driven life despite feelings about appearance. So those who had higher flexibility had less distress. Having self-compassion was also an important factor, and self-compassion was reported more among civilians compared to veterans. The beliefs about how they're perceived by the public, consistent with what we found from the interview study, was also shown to be an important factor. So using what we've learned here from the survey study, we then looked to understand what interventions may be needed. So there's clearly a need for interventions to support veterans and military personnel and their families who have sustained appearance-altering injuries. There's evidence to show that there are some similarities between civilians, but also these military nuances, which might mean that existing civilian support needs to be adapted to be suitable for veterans. Because body image flexibility and self-compassion were two key factors associated with distress, this fits with an acceptance and commitment therapy model of support. Therefore, we propose a multi-level dynamic intervention based upon ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, which is also trauma-informed. We've been able to draw upon some existing interventions for civilians, but we've also adapted them to be suitable for a veteran and military population. This multi-level dynamic intervention at the beginning is about raising awareness among health professionals and those working with military populations with appearance-altering injuries that they may be experiencing appearance-related distress, how to help work with veterans and personnel who may be experiencing that kind of distress, and then also raising the awareness that there may be a need for more specialist care. Then at the next 3 levels are interventions to work with veterans. So at level 2, we have a psychoeducation and self-help materials. So those who are probably experiencing, or the largest number are experiencing distress, but maybe at a lower level, where self-help materials may be enough to help normalize and validate the experience and provide signposting maybe to other resources. Group sessions have been suggested because many veterans have reported that they do well when they are having support interventions with other peers who have had similar experiences. And at the highest level, at level 4, we propose one-to-one therapy for the smaller number of those experiencing the most distress. So since proposing this intervention, we have been working on some prototypes. And so we have developed a 1-page infographic, which is for distribution to anybody working with military personnel and veterans who have sustained appearance-altering injuries, with the aim of educating those working with this military population that appearance distress may be experienced, the evidence that we have developed to demonstrate that, and ways that they could potentially provide support. We've acceptability tested this 1-page infographic with 14 stakeholders and 4 public involvement advisors who are all veterans with lived experience of appearance-altering injuries with positive outcomes. And this is ready for us now to distribute within the UK to those various health professionals that may benefit from it. Also at level 1, we have developed, or we have actually adapted an existing training. So ACT Now was a training developed for health professionals working with civilians with appearance-altering injuries, and we've adapted this to be suitable for health professionals working with veterans. To adapt it, we changed the language, we changed some of the examples to be military specific, we included some slides around military cultural competency, and also included the evidence from our study to provide the rationale for why this training is important. We also included those military-specific barriers to care. We piloted this 1-day training in July, and again had good feedback and overall positive responses, but with some key feedback which we've taken on board and have adapted the programme since. We've also developed an assessment tool aimed for anybody, service providers and health professionals, to be able to identify personnel and veterans who may be experiencing appearance-related difficulties and concerns. Again, we have acceptability tested this with various stakeholders and our public involvement advisors, again with good outcome. However, we won't be able to resource until we make sure that there are available to be signposted to. I do want people to be identified, but then health professionals not know where to provide services. And so then we've also looked at developing some resources to be available for veterans and personnel. So we adapted this resource that was previously developed for civilians, and it's a self-help resource for teaching skills for managing those difficult social situations, such as that unwanted public attention. We have also acceptability tested this with stakeholders and public involvement advisors, again, with a positive outcome. However, before this can be made available, we need to evaluate this fully to make sure that it is actually effective at achieving those outcomes that we hope it would do in terms of alleviating social anxiety and building confidence for social situations. For the group sessions and the one-to-one therapy, within the timeframe of the existing programme of work, we haven't been able to develop these further, and these will be developed further in future grants. And so the next steps for this project are, first of all, we're going to be holding a dissemination event, a free webinar on the 26th of November, where we'll be able to provide more in-depth information than what I've been able to provide in today's presentation. And so if anybody would like to attend that, please do get in touch and you're very welcome to join us. We're also going to be applying for funding for these future studies, so to continue the development of those interventions that I've just presented and to evaluate those to make sure that we can then disseminate them to be effective interventions. And we're also expanding on this research to specifically look at the impact of physical injuries on romantic relationships, since that was something that came out in the interviews as being a challenging area, and also the impact of appearance-altering injuries on the impact of children, which was also identified in this study as being a challenging area. So we'd like to thank everybody, all the public involvement advisors, the participants and the stakeholders who have contributed to this study over the last 3 years, our steering committee members and the chair. And these are the references which I presented throughout this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keeling. We have a quick question for you from the audience. It's a different question than the one I just asked earlier. Sorry about that. So during the study, did you see any utility for identity and social identity theory in finding the solutions to your problems?
Hi, yeah, thanks. I'm sorry about that. My internet connection went at exactly the wrong time. Yeah, so within the interviews that we did, we didn't really target, I guess, talking about identity, but I think that aspects of that loss of the physique of the previous sort of military body, I think that came with that was a lot of identity issues. And I think considering that these individuals would have transitioned, or at least the veterans would have transitioned out of the military at the same time as recovering from their injuries, I'm sure there would have been a complex issue around that. Could we have looked a little bit deeper? And actually, I think something we'd like to look at moving forwards would be how identity plays a role within that adjustment to appearance altering injuries, definitely. Thanks.
Excellent. So I'll ask you the first question again, just because of the timing. In study 3, you found that a higher score on your measure of PTSD were found in the veteran population, and your proposed intervention is trauma-informed. So did you find any evidence of a connection between appearance concerns and or body image and trauma experiences or symptoms?
Yeah, thank you. So in the interviews that we conducted with the veterans and the serving personnel, one of the themes actually that came out of that was that for some of them, their scars or their prosthetics and limb loss reminded them of the event of their injury. And for some of them, it was quite triggering for PTSD symptoms. And so additional analysis that we haven't done yet that we're planning to do is we do have the data to be able to look whether there are associations between those appearance distress measures and also PTSD. So we will be hoping to look at that in more depth.
Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Martin Robinson, and he's going to be talking on ICD-11C PTSD and psychiatric comorbidity among military veterans in Northern Ireland, a latent class analysis. Dr. Robinson.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation looking at ICD-11 complex PTSD and psychiatric comorbidity among military veterans in Northern Ireland. To get a few housekeeping things out of the way first, my conflict of interest disclosures. My name is Martin Robinson, and I am from the School of Psychology in Queen's University Belfast, and I have no faculty conflicts of interest to disclose, no commercial interests to disclose that could potentially give way to conflict resulting from this research. Due to this, there's been no need for mitigation of potential biases, as the study funders have had no role in the design of the research or decision to present or publish. And finally, to acknowledge some of the learning objectives from this presentation, you should, be able to know and understand the psychological comorbidity around complex PTSD, this new diagnosis in the ICD-11. You should understand the statistical methods that are used to identify comorbid groups of symptom presentations, and they should appreciate the implication of psychological comorbidity for the research and treatment of complex PTSD. So to give you an overview of the process of this presentation, firstly, I'll give a little bit of background, talking about what is this, the new diagnosis of complex PTSD and how it might be linked to other psychological disorders. I'll briefly talk about the methodology, how we tested the link between complex PTSD and other mental health conditions. And finally, moving on to what was found and what are the implications of the findings of this research. So firstly, the what and why of this study. What is complex PTSD? Complex PTSD, as I briefly alluded to, is a new diagnosis in the International Classification of Diseases 11. This diagnosis extends the traditional PTSD diagnosis that we're used to from previous iterations of the ICD and adds 3 new symptoms. These 3 new symptoms are regarded as disturbances in self-organization, and they're known as interpersonal disturbances, negative self-concept, and affective dysregulation. These symptoms are experienced on top of the 3 core PTSD symptoms recognized by the ICD: sense of threat, avoidance, and re-experiencing. Typically, complex PTSD is related to what we know as complex trauma, that is, trauma of a prolonged or inescapable nature. Historically, this has led to a lot of focus on complex PTSD being an outcome of childhood trauma or some other form of quite prolonged and inescapable exposure, with little focus on this concept in military veterans. However, the research base for this is growing. Noting the some evidence that we have about traditional PTSD diagnosis from the previous iteration of the ICD and from the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual, we know that PTSD is highly comorbid with other disorders such as anxiety, such as depression, and such as suicidality. However, we also know that PTSD is polymorbid. It's associated with these disorders in isolation and with a direct pathway between each, but also in collaboration. Someone with PTSD might also suffer from anxiety and depression concurrently. To date, evidence on PTSD comorbidity suggests that it performs the same as PTSD and being associated with the same mental health conditions, chiefly among them those common mental health disorders such as generalized anxiety disorder and major depression. However, as I acknowledge, evidence is limited regarding complex PTSD among military veterans, and no studies prior to this looked at complex PTSD and comorbidity among veterans in Northern Ireland, which have a unique experience of living in an operational theatre. So the purpose of this study is to examine the comorbid associations of complex PTSD, finding out if complex PTSD is associated with generalized anxiety disorder, major depression, and indicators of suicidality in the same way as PTSD. And if so, if we do find that complex PTSD is associated with the same comorbidities, does it co-occur with multiple conditions at the same time, like PTSD is known to? I'll give a brief rundown of what the research found. We first of all examined the prevalence of these disorders. Whenever we applied the new questionnaire developed for the ICD-11 diagnostic criteria, we found that around 30% of our sample would have screened positive for PTSD or complex PTSD. But as you can see from the first two graphics on the top left and top right, complex PTSD was by far and away more prevalent than PTSD in this sample of military veterans from Northern Ireland. And consistent with our expectations, we also found similarly high rates of generalized anxiety, major depression, and indicators of suicidality. It should be noted that these rates shown on screen are relatively high, but they are not beyond what might be expected for a general traumatized population, even those in the general population previously exposed to stressful life events. We then moved on to the main analysis of this study, where we examined those with complex PTSD, that 1/5 of people in our sample. How much more likely were they to experience a comorbid probable diagnosis? And whenever we entered this into our statistical model, we found that someone with that would screen positive for complex PTSD was over 40 times more likely to also have a probable generalized anxiety disorder, over 42 times more likely to probably have major depression, and were 8 and 5 times respectively more likely to report suicidal ideation, lifetime thoughts of taking one's life, or lifetime incidents of suicide attempts. Once we identified that complex PTSD was positively associated with those conditions, we entered into a larger latent variable model that tried to find out if someone with complex PTSD is more likely to experience depression, anxiety, and indicators of suicidality. Are they likely to report just one of these or multiple at the same time? Using a latent variable model, we looked at each of these as indicators of groups, and the graph on screen was produced. This shows us the likelihood of an individual reporting any of these mental health conditions across the 5 indicators. However, with each line representing a group. However, it's a little abstract on trying to understand it in this way. So I've broken it down into the 4 groups that we identified, qualifying what how they're defined. First of all, the high comorbidity group comprised around 22% of the sample, and that group had a high probability of reporting all conditions, including complex PTSD. In other words, there was a small group of people, around 22% of the sample, that would have probable complex PTSD and report having anxiety, depression, and indicators of suicidality all at the same time. The next group was the moderately suicidal group. This was an even smaller group, around 12% of the sample, that had a high rate of reporting suicidal ideation, a low rates of reporting suicide attempt, and some likelihood of reporting suicide attempt, and some likelihood of reporting major depression. The third group was the depressed anxious group. Once again, even smaller and the smallest group identified in this analysis, and they had a high likelihood of reporting depression and anxiety together, so suffering from comorbid major depression and generalized anxiety. They had a moderate likelihood of reporting suicidal ideation and attempt, but much lower than that than the moderately suicidal group, and they had a relatively low likelihood of experiencing complex PTSD. And finally, to note, the largest group, the resilient group. This group comprised over half of the sample, and they had a low likelihood of experiencing any condition. So whenever we entered into that latent variable model and considered what was all the indicators of mental health, this group were unlikely to experience any disorders. So we know what was found, but what does it all mean? What are the implications of these findings? So what do we know now about thanks to these results? We know that most trauma-exposed veterans in this population in Northern Ireland are resilient. Over half of them didn't experience any mental health conditions. However, this study was focused on morbidity associated with complex PTSD. We know more about the types of mental health presentations for Northern Ireland veterans. We know now that those with complex PTSD are most likely to experience polymorbidity. Someone with complex PTSD is likely to experience a large degree of functional impairment and to experience multiple mental health conditions at once. And finally, complex PTSD is associated with greater symptom complexity and greater comorbidity across the disorders. The implication of this being our headline finding is that we know that complex PTSD is a very debilitating condition, possibly more so than what we previously recognized as traditional PTSD diagnoses, and it should be considered when in research and treatment. So the implications of this is that we do need to consider complex PTSD in the assessment and treatment, particularly of veterans where this has perhaps gone under-recognized so far. We need to recognize that those struggling with complex PTSD are likely to have multiple conditions. They're likely to experience that polymorbidity, that to experience complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideations all at the same time. And this necessarily has implications for treatment and for case formulation for these individuals. Despite this, we once again do need to acknowledge that most trauma-exposed veterans are resilient, but those that are not resilient are likely to need intensive support. Those who do fall into those symptomatic categories are likely to have particular needs that should be categorized and should be addressed by clinicians and researchers. Unfortunately, however, that leads us to our final implication, is that we don't yet know if PTSD treatments, those that we typically implement for traditional PTSD diagnoses and historically have used to treat veterans and others exposed to trauma, are effective for complex PTSD. The call is therefore to researchers and to clinicians to examine the prevalence rates and the morbidity among this group, but also to examine to what extent the current treatments work to addressing the issues of this group, and if more treatments are required, or different treatments are required to best address the needs of the group. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention during this recording. I have provided my contact information on screen if you want to raise any questions asynchronously, but I will be available for the duration of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robinson. I've got a question for you. Did you look at the presence and role of chronic pain in complex PTSD?
Thank you very much for that question. Unfortunately, it wasn't one of the things that we considered in terms of the comorbidity profiles, although I am aware of some research out of the UK fairly recently that did consider chronic pain as one of the associated things with complex PTSD. It's certainly very interesting because CPTSD is associated with that more debilitating comorbid presentation of psychiatric symptoms, and it would certainly be something that I would look for in future research, would be to examine that chronic pain as an element and psychosomatic pain as an element of potential comorbidities.
Great, thank you. So this research was completed with Northern Ireland veterans. What about other countries and contexts?
Thank you. So yeah, this research was completed with Northern Ireland veterans, which are a unique population, as I mentioned during my presentation, of serving in the place that they lived, oftentimes in a part-time fashion, living and working and serving in the same communities. However, I'm aware of other pieces of research coming from the mainland UK being conducted with treatment-seeking veterans that have similarly recognized deployment to other parts of the world as a potential complex trauma, but also in the Philippines, where combat veterans who have been deployed and operationally active in their local area around the Philippines and deployed elsewhere being assessed for complex PTSD. And similarly, it has been found that veterans in the Philippines had elevated rates of complex PTSD compared to traditional PTSD, suggesting that similarly to our research here, conducted here in Northern Ireland, the complex PTSD is a very real and present concern for veterans returning from their operational deployments.
Interesting. Anything in Canada?
Unfortunately, not to my knowledge at the moment, but it's certainly something that I would be interested in, with a lot of the great work being that is going on at the moment, to try and fit in some research about complex PTSD in addition to everything else.
Cool. So I guess I just have one last question then. So why is it important to assess complex PTSD and comorbidity amongst service personnel or veterans?
Thanks once again. So once again, briefly alluded to in my presentation, I think because complex PTSD we're finding is more prevalent among veterans, and we find is more prevalent among police officers, I think it's an interesting thing that we should be looking for, this thought around operational traumatic stress and how it might contribute to complex PTSD over and above PTSD. And as the results of this study showed, those with complex PTSD experience a lot more comorbidity. For some of the results, we've seen over 40 times greater likelihood of screening positive for depression or anxiety, but also those additional symptoms, that pervasive negative beliefs about yourself, affect dysregulation, and disturbed relationships with others can really help to dampen the effects of therapeutic treatment. So I think it's important to bear in mind complex PTSD whenever we are assessing and formulating assessing individuals returning and formulating treatments for them in order to promote the best outcomes for the group.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Ms. Emily Tang. She will be talking about a decrease in emotional dysregulation following multimodular motion-assisted memory desensitization and reprocessing therapy.
Hi, so my presentation will be on the decrease in emotional dysregulation following multimodal motion-assisted memory desensitization and reprocessing therapy. My name is Emily Tang. I'm a master's student at the University of Alberta. There are a number of partners with commercial interests, as noted on the slide. I have nothing to disclose, nor any conflicts of interest to report. And today I want to talk about the definition of emotional regulation and dysregulation, discuss the potential importance of emotional regulation and dysregulation to PTSD, describe what 3-MDR is, and explore potential hypotheses that may drive 3-MDR efficacy in remediating emotional dysregulation. So PTSD can develop after exposure to a traumatic experience, producing symptoms such as intrusive thoughts, avoidance, hypervigilance, and altered mood and cognition. PTSD prevalence is estimated to be around 5.3% in Canadian Armed Forces members and 16% in Canadian veterans. Individuals who have had less success with traditional evidence-based interventions for PTSD are described as having treatment-resistant PTSD. Emotional regulation refers to one's ability to adaptively regulate emotions when exposed to triggering stimuli. This includes a person's use of strategies such as cognitive reappraisal of aversive stimuli, redirection of attention, and modulation of behavioral responses. Emotional dysregulation refers to difficulties regulating one's emotions following exposure to triggering stimuli. PTSD symptoms, including negative mood, cognitive deficits, avoidance, and hyperarousal, are associated with two forms of emotional dysregulation: emotional under and over modulation. Emotional undermodulation involves poor regulation of negative emotions, leading to hypervigilance, heightened intensity of negative emotions, and poor inhibition and behavioral adaptations. Emotional overmodulation sees overregulation of emotion in the form of repression, extreme avoidance, inability to identify emotions, and depersonalization and/or derealization. Emotional dysregulation can be presented in combat-related PTSD through overlapping symptoms like dissociation, avoidance, persistent negative emotional states, hypervigilance, and prolonged psychological distress. Recent studies have suggested that difficulty with emotional regulation may exacerbate severity and maintenance of PTSD. So 3-MDR stands for Motion-Assisted Multimodal Memory Desensitization and Reconsolidation, which is an immersive, virtual reality-supported, motion-assisted, and exposure-based psychotherapeutic intervention. 3-MDR is delivered in a virtual reality environment with an integrated treadmill system, providing a motion-assisted immersive experience. So 3-MDR intervention consists of 10 sessions that are broken down into 3 session types as shown in the image, and I'll briefly go through the process of 3-MDR. So session 1 is the pre-platform session where participants select and order images and music. The images are related to participants' traumatic experience and are selected and ordered from least to most distressing. A piece of music is identified that reminds the participant of the traumatic experience. and another contemporary piece supports a return to the present moment. Sessions 2 to 7 are platform sessions and involve 3 phases. In the pre-platform phase of the session, the therapist and participant confirm the order of the images and the music for the session. During the platform phase, the participant walks on a treadmill at their own pace alongside the therapist and warms up while listening to the music connecting them to their trauma. Then during each of the 7 3 to 5 minute cycles, they walk down a virtual hallway towards their first image. The participant then describes the image, physical sensations, and feelings to the therapist, who helps them generate descriptive words and phrases that are projected in front of the image. The participant reads these words out loud before undergoing a 30-second dual attention task, where the participant will read aloud numbers that appear on a ball oscillating horizontally in the foreground of the image and the words. And afterwards, the cycle will repeat. The patient will cool down after the 7th cycle while listening to music that facilitates reconnection to the present. At the end of each session, it concludes with the post-platform phase, which includes discussion, reconsolidation, and a mental wellness check and or self-care plan. And then sessions 8 to 10 are the post-platform sessions, which focus on reconsolidation, development of meaning of the acquired gains, and emotional release. The 3MDR study is an ongoing mixed methods, waitlist randomized control trial that explores the efficacy of 3MDR in treating combat-related treatment-resistant PTSD in Canadian military members and veterans. Military members and veterans who are included in the trial were unsuccessful with at least 2 conventional treatments prior, have a score of 30 or higher on the clinician-administered PTSD scale for DSM-5 or a CAPS-5 assessment, are able to walk on a treadmill for 45 minutes, and may also have additional comorbidities. This sub-study is focused on emotional regulation. The purpose of the study is to investigate whether 3MDR reduces emotional dysregulation in military members and veterans with combat-related treatment-resistant PTSD. We hypothesize that 3MDR will correlate with a reduction of emotional dysregulation as measured by the DERS-18. This sub-study is a descriptive quantitative study as part of the larger waitlist control trial. The study examines emotional dysregulation data collected using the DERS-18, which is one of the self-reported questionnaires used during the course of 3MDR. 9 military members and veterans are included in this subsample. So DERS-18 stands for Difficulties in Emotional Regulation Scale, which is a shortened 18-item questionnaire based off of the original DERS. Each question is ranked from 1 to 5 in relatability regarding emotional regulation, and a higher score indicates greater difficulty with emotional regulation. The study included data from 9 participants, all identifying as men, and are predominantly non-commissioned members. A large representation were from the Army, with no Navy members in the sample. As well, most individuals were from the Afghanistan era. 9 participants were used to compare baseline DERS-18 data to the 1-week follow-up time point, and 6 participants were used to compare baseline data to the 1-month and 3-month follow-up time points. The dropout rate for 3MDR was very low. Data was analyzed using a Wilcoxon signed ranks test, which is a non-parametric statistical test. All p-values are below 0.05, indicating statistically significant decreases in DERS-18 scores for all 3 pre-intervention to post-intervention comparisons. This suggests that 3MDR intervention is correlated with a decrease in emotional dysregulation. The decrease in DERS-18 score suggests improvement of emotional regulation following 3MDR. While there is no official clinical cutoff DERS-18 score for what may be considered normalized emotional regulation, a decreasing trend does indicate improvement in regulation over time. The red line shown in this graph depicts the mean scores for 5 participants that had a DERS-18 score recorded at all 3 post-intervention time points. So that's T3, T4, and T5. The mean scores also demonstrate a decrease in overall DERS 18 score following 3-MDR intervention, and also continued decrease month later. So 3-MDR may address emotional dysregulation through its treadmill component. Embodied cognition is a theory that suggests that motor systems are highly interconnected with affective and cognitive systems. So just like how we can regulate our actions through top-down inhibition, our movements and proprioception can also influence our cognitions and feelings. Similarly, physical movement has been associated with divergent thinking, increasing critical thinking, creativity, and open-mindedness. The exposure therapy component also helps facilitate fear extinction, which in PTSD has been hypothesized to be hindered and largely drives the maintenance of PTSD symptoms. Exposure to traumatic stimuli can be difficult to replicate in combat-related PTSD, making 3-MDR really unique in helping desensitize trauma-inducing stimuli and reducing the associated negative emotions, which in turn facilitates improved emotional regulation. The EMDR component works similarly, as the idea of the task is to reduce the intensity of negative emotions and help with reappraisal and reprocessing of associated fear memories. It also engages regions of the brain involved in emotional processing and reduces activity in the regions involved in hypervigilance, fear, and anxiety. All of these components help facilitate emotional regulatory processes, but also neurologically stimulate the medial prefrontal cortex, which in turn sends top-down regulation to the amygdala and reduces its hyperactivity. This restores more of a balance to a dysfunctional prefrontal amygdalar feedback loop, which many studies have suggested is one of the most prevalent neurocorrelates of PTSD. Lastly, 3-MDR might be particularly successful in military members and veterans due to the simultaneous treatment of moral injury, which can be comorbid with combat-related PTSD due to the morally injurious nature of combat-related trauma. Addressing emotional dysregulation can help address the overlapping symptoms between combat-related PTSD and moral injury. Upon addressing emotional dysregulation, participants experience greater ability to identify, acknowledge, and accept emotions. They might also develop strategies to cope with arising emotions more effectively, allowing them to release emotions, control behavior, and restore day-to-day functioning. Addressing emotional dysregulation in PTSD can also reduce hypervigilance. Ultimately, all of this may lead to improving relationships with loved ones, finding pleasures in hobbies and activities again, engaging with the community, and returning to the workplace. This study has a relatively small sample size. There are plans to recruit more patients. However, due to COVID-19, the study has been placed on hold as we haven't had access to the virtual reality system needed for 3-MDR. Our team works with a consortium that includes the UK, US, and Netherlands to further innovate, improve, and adapt 3-MDR. We aim to increase accessibility of 3-MDR to bring 3-MDR into a real-world clinical context, expanding into different populations outside of military members and veterans. In order to build capacity, our group is working to install 4 more 3-MDR units in Edmonton and Calgary, as well as training more therapists on 3-MDR. There's also interest in exploring the use of 3-MDR with other trauma-affected populations and other disorders such as anxiety and behavioral disorders. We're also looking to continue exploring the mechanisms driving 3-MDR to better understand how it works and what conditions it might work for. To conclude, military members and veterans are at higher risk for traumatic exposure. Traditional trauma treatments are less effective for combat-related PTSD, which results in something called treatment-resistant PTSD. 3-MDR challenges standard approaches to conventional psychotherapies and reduces the potential for participant dropout. 3-MDR shows highly effective results for combat-related treatment-resistant PTSD. Preliminary results suggest that emotional regulation is improved following 3-MDR intervention. Results for 3-MDR in general indicate that it can lead to an improved quality of life afterwards. The efficacy of 3-MDR may be due to increased cognitive motor stimulation, facilitation of divergent thinking, and shifts in appraisal of immersive stimuli. 3-MDR may also be beneficial for other trauma-affected populations, and further investigation is still required to fully understand the efficacy of 3-MDR. Our team would like to thank everyone listed for their contributions to our research, and we thank you for taking the time. These are my references. And please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was a fantastic talk. I've got a few questions. For the first one, the rates of trauma, PTSD, and even dissociation seem really high for a community sample. Why is that? Why do you find that?
Thanks, Diane. I believe because of the combat-related nature of the PTSD that we're investigating, avoidance is most likely one of the biggest emotional dysregulation pieces that will be found. And that's something that is also directly addressed with 3-MDR, with the prolonged exposure component of it, excuse me. So I believe that just with the combat-related nature of the PTSD that we're investigating, avoidance will be highly prevalent in this case.
Okay. So during your 3-MDR intervention, how have you looked at emotional dysregulation? Has that been investigated yet, or?
So that's something that we're looking to do, is to investigate how emotional dysregulation will look within the intervention itself. This study was mainly focused on the changes from pre-intervention to post-intervention. What we hypothesize is that it actually might see an increase in emotional dysregulation as the participants are sorting through their trauma, processing their traumatic memories, being exposed to the traumatic experiences. And so I think that's something that needs to be investigated, and also investigating the nature of emotional dysregulation within the context of the traumatic experiences being dealt with in 3-MDR.
So is that something you're going to be looking at in the future definitely, or is that sort of far off, or?
It's a future direction. I'm not sure if it's something, I think it's a little bit more tentative, but it's definitely something we'd like to look into.
Cool. So a lot of network analysis studies are correlational. So can we really say that the network represents a causal connections between symptoms?
With this study, it is very preliminary data. We'd like to involve more data collection and more data analysis to really be able to look into it. Right now, it's definitely something that's more a little bit correlative than it is causation. But with these findings, it is promising, it is optimistic in that 3-MDR is doing something to improve emotional regulation.
That's excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'm not sure, I don't think there's any more questions. Hang on a sec. If we don't have any more questions from the audience, then we can go to our break. Thank you again, Emily. We'll take the break now. We have a 5-minute break, so we'll be back to see everybody at 12:26. I cannot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm here to introduce Sherry Moore. Sherry will be talking about investigating the association between post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociation in a veteran sample. And this is a network analysis. Welcome, Dr. Moore.
Thank you. Hi there, I'm Professor Sherry Armour. I have no commercial interest to disclose. Next slide, please. I'd like to say a thank you to Forces in Mind Trust for their generous funding. There are no potentials for conflict of interest in that regard. Next slide, please. Just to disclose that the funder had no role in the design, the analysis, or interpretation of any of the results that will be presented today. Next slide, please. And just to say, in terms of the learning objectives for today's presentation, at the conclusion of this activity, participants will be able to further their understanding of the PTSD dissociation relationship in military veterans. Next slide, please. Okay, so the title of today's presentation is Investigating the Association Between Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder and Dissociation in a Veteran Sample using Network Analysis. And I'd just like to give a shout out to my co-authors, Anna Kakatera and Emily McGlinchey from the Research Centre for Stress, Trauma and Related Conditions at the School of Psychology in Queen's University, Belfast. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is just to briefly talk about the long-standing association between post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociation. So this has been very much recognised within the scientific literature. And due to this long-standing evidence base, the DSM-5 actually formally included a dissociative subtype of post-traumatic stress disorder in their most recent edition of their diagnostic manual. And actually for participants, or for patients, to receive a PTSD with dissociative subtype diagnosis, they must first meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and then they also have to endorse symptoms of depersonalization and derealization. We're very interested in my research centre in a new statistical technique called network analysis. Network analysis has recently been applied to assess item-level associations between PTSD symptoms and an array of different symptoms across different psychiatric disorders. But in particular, today we're interested in the relationship between PTSD symptoms and symptoms of dissociation. Now, network analysis is kind of almost the opposite thinking from the common cause model. So the common cause model is more typically applied in that it assumes that each symptom of a psychiatric disorder is a common and equal explainer of that disorder. But in network analysis, the theory actually recognizes that psychological disorders are kind of systems of complex networks where the symptoms can interact with each other and interact in a way that they can also mutually reinforce one another. So when we think about this in the context of comorbidity, then comorbidity is proposed to occur when symptoms of one condition actually activate symptoms of a second condition, and then that drives that comorbidity. In relation to PTSD and dissociation, there's been two prior studies which have examined the network structure of PTSD and dissociation. These studies were by Kramer et al. In 2020 and McBride et al. In 2019, and both these studies were conducted in adults. So the McBride study used a sample of 473 Danish adults, who had been seeking psychological treatment for childhood sexual abuse. And they actually found that depersonalization was connected primarily to the PTSD symptoms of nightmares and flashbacks. And then the derealization in dissociation had connections primarily with the NACM symptom cluster and the AAR symptom cluster. So that's the kind of avoidance type symptoms in PTSD. The Kramer study used data from 557 adults with probable PTSD diagnosis. They gathered this data through Amazon Mechanical Turk, and actually thinking about depersonalization and derealization again, they reported that although both were related to the PTSD symptoms of trauma-related amnesia, that depersonalization had strong connections with self-destructive, reckless behaviour and flashbacks, whereas derealization had a weak connection with these symptoms. Now, the authors additionally found that of all PTSD symptoms and dissociation symptoms, depersonalization was the most central symptom in that network. And when we talk about being the central symptom, it had the strongest connections with other symptoms in the network. And the differences across these two studies could actually be due to different measures that have been used or the different trauma types that have been experienced by participants. And this therefore kind of means that we need to further explore this, and we need to further explore those item level associations, but we need to do so in alternative trauma populations. And that's a good rationale for why we're conducting this study with military veterans. Next slide, please. So the data used in the current study, as I said, was part of a large-scale cross-sectional survey. This survey was really focused on the mental health and well-being of UK Armed Forces veterans who were resident in Northern Ireland at the time of completing the survey. It was available to participants both online and in traditional kind of pen and paper format, and we collected the data between December 2017 and June 2019. We had kind of extensive recruitment methods where we engaged with service providers. We had a large-scale social media campaign, and we were also able to text and email participants who had previously said they'd be interested in being approached for participation in future studies. For this particular study, the eligible sample was 619 veterans. Approximately, they were 55 years old, and the majority of the sample was male, as we would expect with military populations. And as maps onto the demographic in Northern Ireland, the majority of participants were white, and they were married or living with a partner. In terms of the relevant measures, we measured our PTSD symptoms with the PTSD checklist, so the PCL, and we measured dissociation symptoms with the Dissociative Symptoms Experience Scale. Next slide, please. Okay, so our analytic strategy actually involves, first of all, assessing the rates of trauma exposure, PTSD and dissociation in the total sample. And then after doing that, we wanted to conduct this network analysis of PTSD and dissociation so that we could explore that comorbidity. So just so you can get a kind of pictorial representation, what you can see on the left-hand side of this slide is just that general example of what a network model looks like. So essentially a network consists of nodes, which are the variables, in this case PTSD and dissociation symptoms, but then also of edges. And the edges are the associations and strength of associations between variables. So the first thing we did here was we estimated our network. We did this by using 20 PTSD symptoms and 9 dissociative symptoms, but it's really important here to note that actually those dissociative symptoms were categorized into their subscales from the DSS. So we had the 20 PTSD symptoms and the 4 subscales of dissociation symptoms. Because our data is continuous, we use the appropriate and common estimation technique, which is the Gaussian graphical model, or GGM. What's happening here when you do this estimation is a little bit like multiple regression. So you are doing your estimation when you're controlling for all other variables in the network. So these relationships can be thought of as partial correlations. After that, we employ a technique called regularization. This essentially shrinks all of those edges and sets the very small edge values to 0. And what happens there is then we get a much more parsimonious network. Regarding the bridge centrality, this is a technique which is commonly used to explore the mechanisms underlying comorbidity, because what it does is it really focuses on identifying which symptoms bridge across those two constructs. So in our case, PTSD and dissociation. So we assess the sum of all the direct associations that a specific PTSD symptom, or a node in this case, has with the dissociation nodes and vice versa. We also looked at accuracy and stability of the network using various bootstrapping methods. And then we used a newer technique, which is the walk trap community detection algorithm. And we used this so we could really explore that distinctiveness of groups of PTSD and dissociation symptoms. Next slide, please. Okay, so just very briefly, participants experienced on average 6.4 traumas, and those were different trauma types. Most common traumas were fire or explosion, being in another situation where you were seriously injured or your life was in danger. An example here is military combat, which makes sense for this population, and also being present when someone was killed, injured, or assaulted. PTSD scores ranged from 0 to 80, and the mean score was 29.78. When we looked at cut-off scores of PTSD, we found that 41.3% of participants met the criteria for a probable PTSD diagnosis, and we used that established cut-off score of 34 that has been tested before on UK veterans, and that is specific to the PCL5. Regarding symptom level means for the 4 dissociation subscales, because remember it was the subscales we used in our network, for depersonalization and derealization, so the mean was 3.14. For gaps in awareness and memory, the mean was 5.19. For sensory misperceptions, the mean was 2.26. And for cognitive and behavioural re-experiencing, it was 2.52. So that gives you a sense of what's going on for the participants. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this figure is essentially the pictorial representation of our network structure of PTSD and dissociation items. The strongest edges were found to be within their relevant communities. So what I mean by that is that PTSD symptoms have more strong connections with other PTSD symptoms, and then the same for dissociation symptoms. So they're more commonly or more strongly connected to each other. Specifically, the strongest edges identified in the network were between avoidance of external reminders and avoidance of thoughts, exaggerated startle response and hypervigilance, depersonalization and sensory misperception. Some of the other associations were between derealization and depersonalization and cognitive behavioral re-experiencing, and between trouble experiencing positive emotions and detachment, and also recurrent memories and recurrent dreams. So lots of different associations going on across all of the symptoms in the network. The presence of meaningful clusters of symptoms within the network was explored, as I said earlier, with the walk-track community detection algorithm. And based on this, a community structure of 5 clusters was detected. So here we found 4 clusters for each of the PCL5 subscales. And then the final cluster actually reflected all of those dissociation subscales together. So essentially our results suggest that clustering is non-random, and therefore these clusters are meaningfully distinct and reflect exactly what we would expect. So we would expect that PTSD clusters within their correct subscales, and we'd expect that dissociation can clusters together as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we also calculated bridge expected influence centrality. And then we plotted this as standardized Z scores, and that's actually the figure that you can see there on the right. So the PTSD symptoms of concentration problems, flashbacks, and negative emotional state had the most frequent and strongest bridge connections into the dissociation items. And of all the 4 dissociation items, so those subscales, the subscale of gaps in awareness had the highest relative bridge expected influence centrality, followed by cognitive behavioural re-experiencing, meaning that these items demonstrated the strongest bridge connections into the PTSD items. So in sum, what this means is that these symptoms contribute most to that comorbidity between dissociation and PTSD in the current sample. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to sum all of this up, what we've found is that PTSD symptoms have strong connections with other PTSD symptoms, and the same works with dissociation. So dissociation strongly connects to dissociation. This is exactly as we would expect, and that clustering actually mimics the results of factor analytic studies in that those symptoms hang together across factor analytic studies. And again, I just want to say that we did use the subscales of the dissociative symptom scale, and using the subscales give us a broader picture compared to those prior studies I mentioned in the introduction, because they had looked specifically at depersonalization and derealization. So even though we're using the 4 subscales rather than the individual items in the dissociation scale, we're still looking at this in a broader way than some of those previous studies. And thinking about explaining PTSD and dissociation comorbidity, the PTSD symptoms, concentration problems, flashbacks, and negative emotional state had the most frequent and strongest bridge connections to dissociation items. So that means that those are the ones who play this biggest role in driving that comorbidity. And then if we take it from the dissociation perspective, it's gaps in awareness, followed by cognitive behavioural re-experiencing linking to PTSD symptoms. So in the adult network studies of PTSD, what we find really consistently so far has been this high centrality of the negative emotional state symptom. And that's actually mapping onto some of the things that we're seeing here in this network analysis in terms of that connection into PTSD and dissociation. Another thing is that DSM-5 explicitly describes flashbacks as dissociative in its very nature. So given the fact that we're seeing here that flashbacks is a symptom that's driving that comorbidity, it's actually an unsurprising result. Next slide, please. So hopefully these results can help clarify this relationship between PTSD and dissociative symptoms, but I just have to kind of always give that cautionary note, because this data was cross-sectional in nature, meaning that we have to be very careful in terms of how we represent this in relation to causal relationships and those dynamic processes between individuals. And actually, additional studies are required in this space, preferably studies which can look at this in a longitudinal framework. Next slide, please. Okay, and these are some of the studies that I have mentioned during the course of today's presentation.
Great, that's very, very interesting. Thank you very much for that. We've got a few questions here. The first is, the rates of trauma, PTSD, and even dissociation seem really high for a community sample. Why is that?
Yeah, so the rates are really high, and actually military veterans who live in Northern Ireland are regarded as quite a unique subpopulation of the UK Armed Forces. It's a unique subpopulation because those are people who saw their active deployment basically in their home nation. So many of them were recruited in a kind of part-time reservist role or in a full-time role to what we call the home services. So they were operational on the streets and in the communities in which they live. And that comes with a lot of kind of nuances around how that has impacted on their mental health and how that has impacted on things like threat perception. And there are still a number of current and ongoing threats for security services here in Northern Ireland. So there's a long legacy of the Northern Ireland political conflict and how that impacts on the mental health of our veterans. Plus, we did have a lot of assistance from local kind of community support groups or support providers to help us recruit our participants. So therefore, we may be seeing some of that come through the data, as well as a kind of natural increase in the rates because of the social political nuances, also the fact that of our recruitment methods. But in saying that, we had very kind of broad recruitment strategy where we had a broad social media campaign. So we were putting adverts out on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all those places. And we were attending kind of local community events for veterans and their families. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. It could be inflated rates because of the situation, or it could be something to do with our recruitment strategy. We're just not really sure.
Right. So has this, have you done any of this work in other countries? Have you looked at that as, because that way you might be able to tease that apart, or has this gone anywhere else?
So I have worked with a number of collaborators in different countries. I've worked with collaborators from Canada as well, from the US, from Australia. And actually we have very recently set up a consortium of collaborators so that we can each take that existing data that we have and start to try to make those comparisons across the data sets. So we've set up an international kind of veterans data consortium so that we can look at comparisons over kind of risk and resilience factors for predictors of mental health outcomes and then the prevalence of those mental health outcomes in our veterans. So we'll be able, it's quite exciting because we'll be able to hopefully make those cross-country comparisons. But at the moment, the research isn't really there in terms of those cross-country comparisons. So kind of watch this space soon, hopefully.
That's really neat. No, that's great. I have another question here. A lot of network analysis studies are correlational, so we can really say So can we really say that the network represents causal connections between the symptoms?
Yeah, well, they're correlational and kind of cross-sectional, and I think this happens when you're at the kind of beginning stages of any new development within the field. And I think that although network analysis of kind of psychopathological symptoms has been around for a considerable amount of time, it really only started coming into the PTSD literature. And I think it was around 2017 we published the first PTSD network analysis study. So it's a growing field in terms of PTSD specifically, but also the methods themselves are growing, and they're growing at a significant rate. So there's new ways of doing network analysis now with longitudinal data. And again, very exciting development is with experience sampling methods data. So when people are kind of responding to their symptoms on like multiple times on a daily basis, that data has now been able to pull into network analysis. So I guess the methods and the application of those methods to the field is still kind of growing, albeit at a very fast rate just now.
Wow, well, that's fantastic. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate you coming and talking to us and giving your speech. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Diane.
So we'll now move on to Andrew Nicholson. He's doing a discussion on mechanisms of posterior cingulate cortex downregulation and symptom decrease in post-traumatic stress disorder using real-time fMRI neurofeedback. Andrew.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Nicholson. I'm an assistant professor at McMaster University in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience. And it's my pleasure and privilege to be able to speak to you today about some emerging and really exciting research that we're doing both at McMaster University and Western University using neurofeedback as a brain training device, particularly to use as a novel adjunctive treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And firstly, I'd just like to say that I have no conflicts of interest to disclose or conflicts in relation to commercial support. And the learning objectives I'm hoping to cover today during this talk is to really create a dialogue between clinicians and researchers with the goal to improve treatment outcomes and translate cutting-edge research into clinical practice. And I'm also hoping to, contribute to the knowledge base surrounding personalized medicine approaches for treating PTSD and really foster community between researchers, clinicians, but also those with lived experience in order to better improve treatment outcomes for post-traumatic stress disorder. And kind of the flow of the talk today is I really want to focus on, what is the problem? And that is the development and suboptimal treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder in Canada. And what are the neural underpinnings of post-traumatic stress and how might we normalize those with brain training devices? And then talk about some real-time neuroimaging, neurofeedback studies that we've been conducting and how this converges with other evidence of EEG neurofeedback and a recent clinical trial in neurofeedback that we've conducted. So I would just like to highlight that this body of work was really produced by a Canadian network of researchers working to reduce the illness burden of PTSD, both at McMaster University and Western University. And some of these individuals include Dr. Ruth Lanius, Paul Fruin, Jean Throberge, and Daniela Ravellino. And again, this is, really building off of 10 years of neurofeedback research conducted by this group. So it's really exciting to be able to share this data with you today. So in terms of presenting the problem, right, this is really the development, but also the suboptimal treatment of PTSD. So we know that trauma exposure rates internationally are very high, and that 13% of Canadian Armed Forces personnel are actually diagnosed with a deployment-related disorder. Mental health disorder, and particularly 1 out of 12 are actually expected to develop PTSD. So this is quite high and much higher than what we see in the general population. What is very alarming, however, is that the treatment rates and dropout rates for PTSD are quite problematic. So dropout rates are about 1 in 3 patients for evidence-based psychotherapies, and about 40% of individuals can actually fail to respond to gold standard treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder. So really there's a considerable amount of room for improvement. And given PTSD has very heterogeneous symptom presentations and complex symptomatology, there's really a high need for novel personalized medicine approaches and novel adjunctive treatments for this disorder. So in terms of the neurobiology of PTSD, if we're going to look at brain training and teaching individuals to self-regulate certain areas of the brain, what might these areas be? And for example, one of these areas, and particularly networks heavily implicated in PTSD, is the default mode network. So this network typically comes online during resting states, and it's related to altered, negative, and even sometimes compartmentalized self-related processing in PTSD, alterations in autobiographical memory related to traumatic experiences, alterations in social cognition. So often, for example, in PTSD, there's kind of a self-injury in the aftermath of trauma. So this shattered sense of self, and this altered and sometimes negatively valient self-narrative can even parallel negatively valient seeking systems. So if an individual believes, I deserve this to happen to me, there's a stain on my soul, I'm a bad person, this can lead and kind of recalibrate someone's seeking system and resulting in negatively valenced high-risk situations, seeking out substance use for emotional numbing, for example, and also suboptimal attachment, love, and security seeking systems. So one area of the default mode network that I want to highlight is the posterior cingulate cortex, and this is one of the main hubs of this network. And one of the main things I want to highlight is that this area is really involved in linking the sense of self to emotions, also future-oriented thinking and episodic memory. And this area is often dysregulated in PTSD, where other forms of treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to normalize activation in this area post-intervention. So building on this idea that the posterior cingulate cortex and the default mode network is really involved in post-traumatic stress, during both the recall and re-experiencing of trauma-related memories, this area, the posterior cingulate cortex, is often hyperactive. And I think this really underscores how self-related processes become fused with memories of trauma and this disrupted self-narrative that are tied to these experiences. So kind of moving beyond just, studying emotion generation in limbic areas such as the amygdala, but also, investigating neural correlates of PTSD that are really tied to the sense of self and how a self-narrative can really be recalibrated in the aftermath of trauma. Additionally, during rest, actually posterior communities of the default mode network are hyperactive, so that posterior cingulate cortex, and hyperconnected, whereas anterior areas are disconnected. So taken together, this is really highlighting that regulating the posterior cingulate cortex in PTSD may be a fruitful avenue for neurofeedback, for example, and trying to regulate this area with novel adjunctive treatments that are neurobiologically informed. So now that we've kind of highlighted the problem, what are the neural underpinnings of PTSD, I would like to talk about how we can actually begin to regulate those areas with something called neurofeedback. So brain training neurofeedback is an example of a non-invasive brain-computer interface, so where we're processing brain activity in real time and feeding this back to the participant such that they are trying to gain control over the signal and regulate these neural areas that are tied to their PTSD symptoms. And it allows individuals to search for cognitive strategies that work for them to really control this brain activity. And this is actually what we did using real-time brain imaging. So here, participants were lying in the scanner and we processed brain activity in real time in the posterior cingulate cortex, so in this default mode network hub. And we fed that back to participants while they're in the scanner through these two thermometers on either side of the screen. So when activity of the posterior cingulate cortex would increase, the bars on the thermometer would increase as well. And this is while they were viewing trauma-related words. So there was an exposure, emotion induction paradigm involved in this experimental design. And if you remember before from the previous slide, during recall and re-experiencing of trauma-related memories, the posterior cingulate cortex really increases in activity. So the bars on the thermometer are indicating activation within that target area. And then there was an orange line as well on the thermometer that would indicate baseline. And what we instructed participants to do was to search for personalized strategies that work for them to decrease the bars on thermometer and downregulate this brain area that's associated with their symptoms. And we didn't provide any other instructions other than that. And what we found is that both in individuals with PTSD and healthy controls is that people were able to significantly decrease that posterior cingulate cortex activity over 3 different neurofeedback training runs over the course of 1 hour. So the red lines indicate activity in the posterior cingulate cortex during regulate conditions, whereas the green line indicates activity during just view conditions. So while people are just viewing that word and not trying to decrease activity in the target area. And the top panel showing the PTSD group. So people are significantly decreasing activation during regulate as compared to view. And this is the same pattern for the healthy control group. And interestingly, what we found is during regulate conditions, not only are people decreasing activation in the posterior cingulate cortex, but other areas of the default mode network, such as the medial prefrontal cortex, also show decreased activity. So this is regulating kind of that self-referential processing network as a whole and areas involved in autobiographical memory during the, during viewing that trauma-related word, which likely has a re-experiencing and recalling aspects. And additionally, emotion centers and limbic system hubs were also showing decreased activation. So the amygdala, for example, showed decreased activation during these regulate conditions. What was very interesting was that for both the PTSD and healthy control groups, reliving symptoms were decreasing over the training and into the transfer run, in which there's no neurofeedback. So that's kind of a session to assess learning effects, but reliving symptoms were significantly decreasing over neurofeedback training, both for the PTSD and the healthy control group. Symptoms of distress were also decreasing, again, for the PTSD group. And I just want to highlight that both groups were viewing personalized either trauma words or highly distressing and stressful words. So that's what the healthy control group was looking at. So there was still kind of that element of hyperarousal in the healthy control group, even though they weren't trauma words associated with PTSD per se. And what's really interesting, this was one single session of real-time fMRI neurofeedback, but the results that I just shared with you really converge with a recent randomized control trial of EEG neurofeedback in PTSD. So this is a more kind of cost-effective and portable form of neurofeedback that I've been discussing so far. And this was actually a 20-session randomized control trial as opposed to a single session mechanistic study. And here, this was kind of the interface. So instead of a thermometer, participants were viewing a spaceship moving across the screen. So when they were in the target zone of alpha wave decreases, the spaceship would move. And alpha wave decreases are associated with the default mode network, and this feedback was provided from just above the posterior cingulate cortex on the scalp. So this is kind of synonymous to the feedback that we had presented participants in the real-time fMRI study. And what we found actually over this clinical trial of 20 sessions was that participants in the experimental group actually showed significant decreases in PTSD severity scores post-intervention and at the 3-month follow-up. And that 61% of individuals actually no longer met criteria for PTSD at the end of this trial, and there were no patient dropouts, which really speak to the tolerability of this treatment. And what's really promising, I think provides a lot of hope for people, is that this treatment, the active effect size as well as the remission rates are comparable to that of gold standard treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder. So in summary, this clinical trial showed significant decreases in PTSD severity scores that were unique to the experimental group, and remission rates were comparable to that of gold standard treatments. And this was actually a quote from one of the participants in the trial, and they said, you know, it's like someone had gone into my brain and put everything back together. It's like someone had made some connections, and by the end of it, I felt more in control. I don't feel out of it, and I feel more together. And in summary, you know, the mechanistic study that I presented in real-time fMRI neurofeedback, I think shows strong preliminary evidence that real-time fMRI neurofeedback results in a normalization of the neural circuits that really maintain and result in PTSD symptomatology, and that even a single session of neurofeedback resulted in acute decreases in state symptoms, so both reliving and distress. And then this converges with our clinical trial of neurofeedback, which looked at, you know, feeding back a similar neural signal as posterior cingulate cortex activity, and that remission rates for that trial are comparable to that of gold standard treatments for PTSD. And there were no patient dropouts there. And we also looked at fMRI pre-post that showed a normalization of neural circuits there as well. So I think this provides a lot of hope for individuals, especially those who may be resistant to kind of gold standard current interventions for PTSD. And neurofeedback also may be beneficial for individuals who may be too dysregulated, dissociated, or anxious to tolerate other forms of treatments such as exposure-based treatments for PTSD. And I would just like to, you know, acknowledge the team that really made all of this research possible, particularly Dr. Ruth Lanius, Daniela Ravellino, Paul Fruin, and Jacques Roberge at Western University, as well as Thomas Ross in Geneva, and thank our funding sources as well, in which this wouldn't have been possible. And these are the kind of featured references regarding the talk today, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this point.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Nicholson. That's very interesting. I've got a couple of questions for you. The first is, what are the future directions or next steps for your neurofeedback work?
Hi, Diane, and thank you for that question. I think it'll be really important, you know, moving forward, that as we start to conceptualize psychiatric illness more as disorders of dysregulated neural networks, to actually look at regulating multiple areas in the brain, regulating kind of a network-based approach to neurofeedback, as compared to looking at, you know, these isolated areas such as emotion centers or centers involved in self-referential processing, like I presented just now of the posterior cingulate cortex. I think it'll be really critical moving forward to take a network-based approach as well.
Interesting, that's cool. And so why is it important to show a convergence of neurofeedback modalities then?
Yeah, so I think fMRI neuroimaging is great. It really allows us to hone in on the neural mechanisms of neurofeedback with really high spatial specificity, and looking at very small structures in the brain, particularly in the brainstem that's related. So for example, the reptilian brain structures are really involved in hyperarousal, fight or flight responding, and defensive processing. That's really important, and to show, you know, proof of concept for this emerging intervention. However, you know, as you know, neuroimaging is not portable, it's very expensive, and it would be hard or difficult to implement in a clinic, especially remotely. So I think using forms of neurofeedback like EEG, which are quite cost-effective in comparison, and they're portable, will be a critical step in terms of clinical translation of this research. And also, for example, to use neurofeedback when military members are deployed, for example, you know, or rural populations in Canada. And, you know, we know there's quite a barrier in terms of access to care across the scale. So really having those portable forms of neurofeedback that people can even use in their homes, right? Especially right now, everything's virtual, or most mental health care settings are virtual. So having that portable form of neurofeedback, I think, is so critical.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. And our next speaker now is Dr. Rachel Plouffe, and she is going to give us a presentation on cross-national development and validation of the moral injury outcome scale. Rachel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Rachel, and I'm a postdoctoral associate with the McDonald Franklin OSI Research Centre and through the Department of Psychiatry at Western University in London, Ontario. And today I'm going to be talking about our work on the cross-national development and validation of the moral injury outcome scale. So first, I would just like to acknowledge our co-authors and research team for their support and their hard work on this project. So this was a really large international undertaking that took many years of effort. So I just want to thank everyone for their contributions. And this work is currently under review in psychological assessment. So I have no relationships with commercial interests to report. And our program has received support in part through the USVA, the Phoenix Center for Post-Traumatic Mental Health, and the Center of Excellence for PTSD. We have no potential for conflicts of interest to report, and we don't anticipate any potential for bias. So by the end of this talk, you should be able to describe the development and validation process associated with the Moral Injury Outcome Scale, or the MIOS, summarize the associations between MIOS scores and relevant mental health and well-being variables, and identify cross-national implications associated with development and validation of the MIOS. Military personnel worldwide frequently encounter moral and ethical challenges as part of their service, and these challenges may result in lasting psychological outcomes known as moral injury. So moral injury occurs as a result of exposure to what are called potentially morally injurious events, or PMIEs, which entail acts of commission or omission by oneself, or bearing witness to, learning about, or being the direct victim of acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs or expectations, and these acts are perpetrated by others. So there is, however, no current gold standard measure of moral injury as an outcome, perhaps partially due to the absence of qualitative evaluations of lived experiences of military personnel exposed to moral harms. So there are a couple of measures that currently exist, including the Moral Injury Symptom Scale military version and Expressions of Moral Injury Scale military version. So unfortunately, there are shortcomings associated with these scales, including, for example, a lack of content validity and the use of bifactor models, which can cause researchers to rely too heavily on fit indices. So based on this information, our objective was to cross-nationally develop and validate a measure of moral injury as an outcome, and we called it the Moral Injury Outcome Scale, or the MIOS. So we developed and validated the MIOS across 3 different phases. The first phase was item generation and initial scale construction. The second phase was examination of the factor structure and item trimming. And third and finally, we established convergent and discriminant validity of the MIOS using a separate sample. So first, in phase 1, the consortium conducted qualitative semi-structured interviews of service members, veterans, and clinicians across all the consortium countries, and they arrived at these 6 domains, including self-perceptions, moral thinking, social impacts, self-harming and self-sabotaging behaviors, impairing moral emotions, and beliefs about meaning and purpose. So I'm not going to get into all these definitions in detail just because of time constraints, but they are here if you're interested. And from these domains, the initial 49 item pool was derived, and then 19 staff members and research assistants took part in a card sorting tasks where they sorted the items into their respective domains. And items that were agreed upon by at least half of the individuals were retained for the final scale. So the final scale included 34 MIOS items that were tested for the validation procedures. And some of these sample items included things like, I'm not the good person I thought I was, I have trouble seeing goodness in others, etc. So next, in order to examine the factor structure and conduct item trimming, we conducted phase 2 using 5 separate samples across countries. So our first sample was a veteran sample collected by the McDonald Franklin OSI Research Center, and this is a national Canadian sample recruited online. And next we had a treatment-seeking sample from Ottawa, Canada, followed by veterans from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. And most of them were men between around the ages of 20 and 75 approximately, and most of them were recruited to conduct or complete the MIOS rather online. So participants responded to the MIOS, which was a series of questions and experiences they may have had after experiencing a potentially morally injurious event. So they were asked, while keeping this worst event in mind, please read each of the statements and select one of the numbers to indicate how much you agree with the statement in the past month. And they responded on a 4-point scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So we used the national Canadian sample to first conduct an exploratory factor analysis and to trim the item pool down. So our goal was to reduce the 34 item scale to a more parsimonious set of items while ensuring that we maintained content validity. So we sequentially removed items on the basis of a combination of factor loadings above 0.3, cross loadings below 0.3, maintaining that full content coverage of the domains, and we wanted to reduce the redundancy of the items. So we ended up with 2 factors, including shame-related moral injury outcomes and trust violation moral injury outcomes. So this is the final 14-item scale here on the left. So you can see the first 7 items. They have bolded loadings here, and they're all above 0.3. So they load onto that shame-related factor, including I'm not the good person I thought I was, I feel like I don't deserve a good life, etc. And the bottom 7 items here represent trust violation-related outcomes. So these have the strongest loadings above 0.3 on trust violation-related factor, including, for example, I've lost faith in humanity, I lost trust in others, I have trouble seeing the goodness in others, etc. So next, using the Ottawa, Canada sample as a reference group, we tested the cross-national invariants of the MIOS for both the United States and the United Kingdom samples. So first, we tested for configural invariants, which tells us whether or not the number of factors and the pattern of factor loadings is the same across the countries. And we found that this was satisfied for both the US and the UK. Next, we tested for what's called metric invariance. So this is where you test whether or not the factor loadings are invariant across the samples. And if we look at the difference tests between the metric and the configural models, we found that we did achieve metric invariance for both the US and the UK. And then finally, we tested for what's called scalar invariance. So what this means is if you have 2 individuals from a different country, so you might have, for example, someone from the US and someone on the UK with the same latent variable score on, for example, shame-related outcomes, they should also have the same scores on the items associated with that factor. But this is a really, really stringent type of invariance to fulfill, so it did not pass this test. So we freed one of the intercepts for each country, and we achieved what's called partial scalar invariance. And from here, we compared latent means across the countries, and we found no significant differences between the US and Ottawa in shame-related outcomes, but Ottawa scored higher than the US on trust violation-related outcomes. When we looked at the differences between the UK and Ottawa, we found that the UK scored significantly higher than Ottawa on both shame-related outcomes and trust violation-related outcomes. So next, we also wanted to test for invariance of the Australian sample, but because the sample size was pretty small, it was an N of 118, it wasn't possible to conduct the standard invariance testing. So we used what's called multiple indicators, multiple causes modeling. So we regressed country, Australia and Canada, onto both MIOS factors, and we found country did not have a significant effect on shame-related outcomes or trust violation-related outcomes. And next, we regressed country onto each item and fixed the direct effects to 0. And as we expected, we found that the items performed similarly across the countries. So in our phase 3, we wanted to establish convergent and discriminant validity of the MIOS. So we recruited another United States sample of veterans and active duty members of the military who were deployed to post 9/11 conflict. Most endorsed that they had experienced a potentially morally injurious event, but a subset of them did not. They were mostly men between the ages of 30 and 39, and they were recruited through Qualtrics panels. So to evaluate convergent and discriminant validity, we administered several measures, including those for depression, PTSD, state shame and guilt, trauma-related guilt, anger, loneliness, another measure of moral injury, and the dark triad traits, which are psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism, and social desirability. So this table looks kind of busy, but just to give you kind of the big picture here, we did find that the MIOS factors and the total score correlated in expected directions with these scales. So for example, we found strong positive correlations with things like PTSD, depression, low psychosocial functioning, trauma-related guilt, loneliness, etc. One really interesting finding that we were not expecting was that the dark triad traits, so these are kind of maladaptive subclinical level traits, correlated positively with moral injury. So you would not expect that individuals who endorse high scores on things like low empathy, callousness, lack of remorse, you wouldn't expect there to be a relationship here, a positive one, with moral injury. So that was surprising. But overall, the 14-item MIOS was highly reliable and had a robust 2-factor structure, including shame-related and trust violation-related moral injury outcomes. We achieved partial scalar invariance across nations, and we found that Ottawa scored higher than the US on trust violation-related outcomes, and the UK scored higher than Ottawa on both factors of moral injury. We can't really speculate yet as to why. This requires replication in epidemiological studies in order to draw conclusions about these differences. We did find strong convergent validity for the MIOS, but somewhat questionable discriminant validity. So again, like I was mentioning, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism correlated positively with moral injury. We have a couple of possible explanations, one being that subclinical traits like these that are maladaptive don't necessarily prevent you from experiencing a potentially morally injurious event, nor do they prevent the significant impairment that follows these PMIEs, so the moral injury that follows and the clinical problems as a result. Another possible explanation is the item content itself in the dark triad items almost sounds like people high in moral injury would endorse it. So for example, one of the Machiavellianism items is, it's not wise to tell your secrets. And one of the psychopathy items is, I avoid dangerous situations. That's a reverse scored item. So you would almost expect someone high in moral injury to endorse these types of items. So that's just something to think about. So overall, the MIOS can be used in clinical and research settings to identify functionally impairing moral injury and to track change in moral injury over time. And overall, this will enhance our understanding of mechanisms underlying moral injury and will in turn allow for more effective personalized treatments. So a couple of limitations that we should address are the strong correlations between the shame-related outcomes and the trust violation-related outcomes. There were strong subscale correlations around 0.7. However, you would expect somebody who's exposed to one kind of a potentially morally injurious event, especially someone in the military, to be exposed to perhaps another type. So this isn't surprising, and the correlations aren't so high as to suggest that they're redundant constructs. We also need to determine whether or not our results are generalizable, not only across countries, but across, for example, veterans and actively serving members, as well as women and men, for example. We also don't have a clinical cutoff yet for clinical significance of moral injury, but that is something that Brett Litz and his team are working on in order to provide treatment to these individuals. And finally, there are always risks with employing self-report measures. There's a possibility that people will present themselves in a more favorable light than is warranted. But I always say that the best person to ask about one's characteristics is the person themselves. And here are some references if you are interested in taking a look. And thank you so much for being here and for listening today. I have links to our website, our Twitter, as well as my email address if you have any questions at all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Floof. That was a fantastic talk. I've got a few questions. The first one is from the audience. Doesn't the focus on events cause problems in context of polytrauma when the different traumas could evoke different responses? So in other words, might the individual respond yes, no to in certain items in relation to one trauma, but answer differently in regards to another PMIE, leading to inaccurate low scoring?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So in the instructions on the MIOS as it's currently written, they're asked to think about the most distressing event that they've experienced related to whether they have had a transgression committed against them or whether they have transgressed or whether they felt betrayed by another individual. So as it stands right now, they're basically responding to the most stressful event that they've encountered. And of course, it's possible that they'd respond differently to different types of events. And that's definitely something to consider. But at least for clinical purposes, it might be the most beneficial to focus on that that event that affected them the most in general. And then perhaps they can complete it at another time in clinical practice about their general characteristics. But right now we have it set up that so it's linked to a specific distressing event.
Okay. And do you see this as potentially being more widely applicable to than other moral injury scales because it's being focused on the military exclusively?
Yeah, I think so. I think the way the items are written, it is definitely possible to employ them across contexts, not just in the military, although we would have to undertake validation procedures in other samples. Like if we're thinking about healthcare workers, frontline workers during the COVID pandemic, that is one avenue that we have been thinking about and we will be potentially exploring. First responders, yeah, there are many, many groups who may have experienced moral injury. So the point is not just to target veterans, but make it widely applicable for sure.
Right, right. Okay, so what are the next steps in terms of establishing the MIOS as a tool to assess levels of moral injury? You sort of touched on it a bit there, but.
Yeah, exactly. Just to expand on that a bit, right now we are sort of planning next steps in terms of validating the MIOS in a healthcare worker sample. So we have been launching sort of this longitudinal study during COVID-19 in healthcare workers and in veterans as well. So we have used our veteran sample for this particular study, and then we want to expand on that. And one of the next steps might be to look at healthcare workers and to see whether or not this type of measure is applicable to them as well as veterans during the pandemic, especially. So their morally distressing event could be anything that happens in their own practice as healthcare workers. And another step that we're currently undertaking is the MIOS has been translated to Hebrew right now. So we are working on validating it in Israel, in an Israel sample, and in additional samples within the United States and Australia, so that we can generalize our findings to these other groups. So stay tuned.
Well, thank you very, very much for talking about that. That's really very interesting. We've reached the end of our conference now, so I want to thank you, and I want to thank all the other presenters who have gone through. I would like to thank the audience for coming, and we've learned a great deal today about military sexual trauma and its effects. I've had a very interesting talk about veterans-related problems, including complex PTSD, how work is being done both nationally and internationally to help with a variety of issues. And finally, there was a discussion we just had about the development of a moral injury scale. I look forward to hearing more about all of this and how it's being done in the future. So now we'll talk with Dr. David Pelter.
Thank you all for joining us on day 2 of CIMVHR Virtual Forum. Mr. Paul Roos and Diane Grohl, thank you for leading today's sessions as moderators. The questions and discussions you guided truly make these events. To the researchers who presented today, thank you for the time and effort you put into educating us on your important research work. We have all learned so much from you today. I will once again encourage all of you to submit your research to CIMVHR's Journal of Military, Veteran, and Family Health. Details on how to do this can be found on the CIMVHR website under Publications. Please take some time to explore the conference platform, visit the sponsors' booths, see all the poster presentations, and watch the recorded sessions from our kickoff event and our Serving Military session. A reminder that you can receive continual professional development credits on any recorded sessions until November 5th. I look forward to seeing everyone next Thursday, October 21st, for day 3 of oral presentations that will focus on the family and the serving military. To all of you and your families, please stay safe and be well. Thank you.